We're finally sitting in front of Junt's SNES collection.
After all this time.
We've talked about it for years on multiple podcasts. We mentioned one of the collector's items on Scavenger Junt.
Yep.
But we've never actually put it all together in one place and talked about it. You've had this collection since the early 2000s?
Yeah, early 2000s, like 2003 is when I started collecting, and then kind of wound down the end of the 2000s.
And it was never exhibited anywhere.
Nope.
It was always in storage.
Yeah, from the day I bought it, actually, I was packing it into containers and putting it away. I mean, this is just a piece of the collection, and you can see it takes up a lot of room and is quite an impressive display.
It was work to bring it over to our studio, create a set out of it. There's not only a tremendous number of games, but there's also some obscure peripherals.
Yes.
This show, our intention is to make it sort of like an antique roadshow.
Yeah.
Where we show off various parts of the collection, talk about interesting pieces of old technology.
That's right.
Do you have stats on the collection?
So for US games, I have 624 individual cards. Of those, 527 are unique, and that's 74% of all Super Nintendo USA releases. I have about 140 Japanese games, about 15 or 20 European games from the UK mostly.
Why Super Nintendo?
Super Nintendo for me was kind of the point in my video gaming life that was the most nostalgic. Final Fantasy II, games like Super Mario World, all the RPGs I played were all mostly on the Super Nintendo. I had the NES growing up too, but by the time that I was a teenager and I was playing the most video games, it was definitely with the Super Nintendo. And also, when I had the Nintendo, I only really had 4 games because games were very expensive.
When the Nintendo 64 era came along, you kind of fell off a little?
No, I switched to PlayStation, which was a good platform and had some games I enjoy, but the games were never quite as like magical and really well put together on the PlayStation as they were on the Super Nintendo. In the early 2000s, there was a little bit of interest in resurgence, but not much yet. Games like Chrono Trigger that were very expensive, but most games were still pretty cheap. Even things that were pretty uncommon.
Where were you finding them?
eBay. I have been using eBay basically since it started.
What about Funko Land?
Funko Land was another big one.
This is how most stores feel about buying your old video games. This is how we feel. Funcoland, more video games than anybody else at half the price.
The lifespan of the Super NES was something like 91 to like 96 or so.
Yeah, it was in that range.
And then in the early 2000s, it was considered retro video games, but not like 20 years ago.
Yeah, and emulators were pretty good around that time, not great. Not many people were into emulation as a thing.
Right.
So most people still wanted to play on physical carts at that point.
And they probably had their systems ready to go.
Yeah, they still had their system.
And yet the demand wasn't there because it wasn't considered collector's items yet.
Yeah.
You were collecting before a lot of people were collecting Super Nintendo.
That's right.
If you had to buy this collection from scratch today.
Yeah, I don't think I would.
Yeah.
It would be a huge financial undertaking. It would probably be in the $35,000 to $40,000 range.
And what would you guess you paid in total? Rough estimate.
Probably $4,000 or $5,000. There were a few big buck items that kind of jumped that total way up.
What's your most expensive item?
It was the gun, for sure, which we will see on an episode of the show. That's the Max gun and the cartridge associated.
Around the time I met you, which was like 2000, you were developing your own Super Nintendo RPG.
Yes.
Or a Super Nintendo style.
Well, I had always loved RPGs, right? And it had been a long-running side project to make a game. I used to make these little smiley games that had a little smiley character that moved around the screen. That kind of died, and then I picked up another one that kind of died. And then I found this platform that's called RPG Maker, and it is like the embodiment of Super Nintendo. It came with a big graphics library that looks like it's right off the Super Nintendo. Came with these really great pre-composed MIDI files that sound exactly like a Super Nintendo. And then I went and expanded that. I added some additional features to it with scripting, and I also wrote some of my own music for it. The beauty of that software was that you could just kind of sit down with it, and there was a lot of things you could do without having to know any programming at all. You could make a pretty fun game with the stock resources. I wrote the music using Cakewalk, which is what I used to write all my music at the time, but the sound itself actually comes through RPG Maker. So in order to play it back, I had to play it back through RPG Maker.
So throughout this show, I'm going to be playing, like in our intros and outros and stuff like that, selections from your RPG, which never was finished.
No, not at all. Not at all. Making any game is a huge undertaking, right? And eventually,
what was it called?
Rightly Through the Twilight. You can put it as a download. The installation process is slightly laborious, but you can do it. I can write you instructions.
All right, so we've got tube TVs.
We've got tube TVs.
We've got peripherals. We've got games.
So many games.
We're going to make a bunch of episodes for you of JuntSNES. JuntSNES.
JuntSNES.